Coming up on this Wednesday edition of Newsline at noon, the governor of Missouri deploys hundreds of National Guard to Ferguson to try and prevent a repetition of the violence that shook the city Monday night while protests spread across the United States. Despite expansionary government policies and recent rate cuts, consumer sentiment in Korea worsens to below the level seen following April's ferry disaster. Plus, heralding the start of its massive restructuring plan, Samsung Group decides to sell its chemical and defence businesses to another local conglomerate, Hanwha. These stories and more on Newsline at noon.
It's noon Wednesday, November 26th here in Korea. Thanks for tuning in. Live from Seoul, I'm Eoh Jin-joo.
It's very good to have you with us. I'm Mark Broome, and we start in the United States, where after a night of chaos in Ferguson, the governor of Missouri has tripled the number of National Guard in the city in preparation, hopefully not, for more violence.
Protesters repeatedly clashed with police and looters ran riot overnight after a grand jury decision not to indict a white police officer was announced who killed an unarmed black teenager. Connie Lee reports.
Residents of Ferguson, Missouri woke up to this, a horrific scene of burnt cars, wrecked buildings, and charred businesses after a night of looting and chaos. President Barack Obama, speaking in Chicago, strongly condemned the violence.
Those who think that what happened in Ferguson is an excuse for violence, I do not have any sympathy for that. I have no sympathy at all for destroying your own communities.
And Missouri Governor Jay Nixon called the devastation heartbreaking and unacceptable as he called for the deployment of more National Guard troops.
The National Guard presence will be ramped up significantly in Ferguson and ensuring that they are ready to act quickly to prevent violence. This community deserves to have peace.
The governor has tripled the number of troops to 2,200 in the Ferguson area. It's an attempt to avoid another shocking night like this, where protesters destroyed property, set cars after cars on fire, and clashed with authorities. The trouble saw more than 60 people arrested after a grand jury decided not to indict white police officer Darren Wilson for the deadly shooting of unarmed black teenager Michael Brown. However, Ferguson wasn't the only city affected by the jury's decision. All across the U.S., demonstrators took to the streets. From Atlanta to Seattle, thousands marched in protest, mostly in peace, as the effects of this fiercely disputed case continues to send shockwaves of racial tension throughout the nation. Connie Lee, Arirang News.
Now, protesters furious with the jury's decision in the Michael Brown case say the entire process was sloppy, callous, and biased in favor of the white police officer, Darren Wilson.
Yes, our Ji Myung-gil reports on what they see as an investigation full of holes.
Controversy abounds about how the grand jury reached its decision in the police shooting case. What we know is that 12 citizens were randomly picked in the Missouri grand jury, 9 white and 3 black. And according to state law, 9 out of the 12 jury members would have had to vote yes to indict Officer Darren Wilson. Michael Brown's family have complained about how jury members typically meet behind closed doors to encourage witnesses to speak freely and to protect the defendant's reputation. Prosecutor attorney Robert McCullough has also faced accusations of being biased as his father, a St. Louis County policeman, was shot dead by an African-American man in 1964. Many protesters say the prosecutor was not impartial and are calling for the appointment of a new special prosecutor to replace him. Brown's family have the option of filing a wrongful death lawsuit against prosecutor McCullough. The Justice Department is conducting a separate probe into the Ferguson case to look into whether civil rights violations occurred or not, which could lead to federal charges.
The department's investigations will continue to be thorough. They will continue to be independent. and they remain ongoing to rebuild understanding and to foster cooperation between law enforcement and community members.
Officials will also look into the Ferguson Police Department to examine possible patterns of discrimination. Michael Brown's family is pushing for a new legislation that will require all police officers to wear body video cameras. Kim Young-gyun, Arirang News.
And moving on, consumer sentiment in Korea dropped to its lowest point in more than a year this month, despite government efforts to prop up the ailing economy. Sluggish economic conditions at home and abroad were to blame. Hwang Jie has the details.
The Korean government is trying to boost economic sentiment through a set of aggressive stimulus measures, but those efforts are not bearing fruit, not yet, at least. The Bank of Korea says the country's consumer sentiment index came in at 103 this month, down 2 points from a month earlier. The figure is even lower than the level recorded just after the Seoul ferry sinking in April, a tragedy that seriously dented private consumption. The index hovered at around the 108 level in the first 4 months of this year, but dropped to 105 in May following the disaster. Despite the drop, a reading above 100 indicates that optimists still outnumber pessimists. The monthly index reflects the overall economic outlook of consumers, their living conditions, and future spending plans. The central bank says the drop in this month's index largely stems from sluggish domestic demand and worsening global economic conditions like the weakening Japanese yen and the U.S. Federal Reserve cutting back its stimulus measures. Experts add that concerns over the slowing profitability of local exporters were also reflected in this month's Consumer Sentiment Index. Korea is heavily reliant on exports, which account for more than half of the country's total output. Hwang Jie, Arirang News.
And another concern in the eyes of a state-run think tank is that Korea may fall into a long-term economic slump similar to what Japan experienced in the 1990s. It recommends the country's central bank to take bolder steps when it comes to its monetary policies. For more on the growing signs of deflation in Korea, here's Kim Ji-an.
There's fears Korea could be taking the same deflationary path as its neighbor Japan, which experienced a 10-year economic slump. Lee Dae-jun, an economist at the Korea Development Institute, pointed to Korea's falling prices and low inflation rates as the main reasons for drawing the comparison. The country's consumer prices remain trapped in the 1% range for a full 2 years due to low demand, recording well below the government's target of 2.5 to 3.5%. It's a dismal sign as sluggish demand was attributed as the main reason for deflation. In Japan's case, in the early 1990s, dragging down the country's real estate prices and its GDP deflator, which measures the prices of all domestically produced goods. Much like Japan, Korea's GDP deflator increases are dipping low into the 0% range this year after it first started to decline in 2011. The researcher warns Seoul should be more vigilant and take preemptive measures to tackle the country's low inflation rate, such as cutting its main benchmark interest rates. He adds it's important Seoul takes into account the downward trend of real wages and expected inflation when making decisions on its monetary policies. In 1995, Tokyo lowered its policy interest rate by 0.5% to turn the economy around from recession, but the effect was short-lived as the country's real interest rate went up due to deflation. The Bank of Korea will announce a decision on December 11th on whether to further lower the current interest rate of 2% following previous rate cuts in August and October. Kim Ji-an, Arirang News.
The OECD has lowered its 2015 growth forecast for the Korean economy to 3.8%, down from its previous forecast of 4.2% made in March. Now, this confirms the organization's preliminary outlook presented earlier this month ahead of the G20 summit in Brisbane, Australia. The Paris-based agency pointed to mounting household debt as the biggest risk factor that stems from the government's policies to boost the nation's housing market. It warned that Seoul should make a cautious move in its push for such measures. As for the year 2016, the OECD projected the Korean economy to grow 4.1%. Korea's top conglomerate Samsung Group is planning to sell 4 of its affiliates to Hanwha Group. The move comes as part of Samsung's reorganization efforts to increase its competitiveness. Eoh Jin-joo tells us more.
A $1.7 billion deal is about to be signed between 2 of Korea's biggest conglomerates. On Wednesday, industry sources said that Samsung Group is set to sell 4 of its affiliates to Hanwha Group. Considering Samsung hasn't sold any of its affiliates to a domestic rival for nearly 2 decades, the news is a big deal to many. The deal is this. Samsung is selling its defense firms, Samsung Techwin and Samsung Thales, along with its chemical affiliates, Samsung General Chemicals and Samsung Total Petrochemicals, to Hanwha. This means Samsung Group plans to pull out from its defense and chemical businesses. Instead, Samsung is planning to invest and focus more on its core businesses to bring in more profits. They include electronics, financial services, engineering, and construction. Experts say Samsung seems to be taking aggressive steps toward restructuring, doing away with affiliates that undermine the group's competitiveness. They add the company also seems to be getting ready to transfer the group's ownership to the next generation of the family, considering its head Lee Gun-hee was hospitalized after suffering a massive heart attack in May. Hanwha, which will be buying Samsung's 4 affiliates, is Korea's 10th largest conglomerate. It was designated as a defense firm in the mid-1970s. Once signed, the deal is expected to be completed in the first half of next year. Lee Jun, Arirang News.
The profitability of non-finance-based Korean companies last year fell to its lowest level since the 2008 global financial crisis, according to data from Statistics Korea, which does not include financial and insurance companies. The nation's construction and transportation firms fared the worst. The data, based on a survey of more than 120,000 firms, showed that companies made an average of 39 won in net profit last year for every 1,000 won worth of sales. This is the worst number since 2008, when companies turned an average profit of 32.5 won per 1,000 won in sales. The agency attributes the sluggish profitability to the tough economic conditions and increased competition in global markets. After 4 years of banning the provision of any fertilizer aid to North Korea, Seoul says it's now willing to consider easing sanctions and help out its northern neighbour, but only if Pyongyang guarantees transparency. Speaking at a forum on inter-Korean cooperation on Tuesday, Unification Minister Ryu Kil-jae said South Korea is considering measures to help North Korea's agriculture and forestry industries. He said Seoul is willing to take the first step for the 2 Koreas to build trust and hopefully break down the barriers that stand in the way of friendship. South Korea banned rice and fertilizer aid to North Korea in 2010. This after the North torpedoed the South Korean warship Cheonan in the same year. Korea's Constitutional Court listened to the closing arguments on Tuesday in the case against the left-wing Unified Progressive Party, which is accused of some very serious charges, namely conspiring with North Korea to overthrow the South Korean government. Kim Hyun-bin reports.
The Constitutional Court on Tuesday heard closing arguments in a trial that will ultimately determine whether the minor opposition Unified Progressive Party will be forced to disband over accusations it had plans to overthrow the government. Justice Minister Hwang Kyo-an, speaking on behalf of the state, told the court that the UPP based itself on a political doctrine that violated South Korea's constitutional order. He claimed the party's political objective was to instigate a rebellion against the government and achieve a federal form of unification with Pyongyang. Chief of the UPP, Lee Jung-hee, countered and defended her party before the court, saying it had no affiliation whatsoever with North Korea and that the government was guilty of political suppression. The accusations date back to last year when lawmaker Lee Seok-gi and 3 UPP members were arrested on charges of plotting to topple the South Korean government and blow up major government facilities in the event of a war with the North. They are still awaiting a Supreme Court ruling on those charges. The Constitutional Court did not decide when they would deliver the ruling to determine whether the UPP will be allowed to continue on as an official party. If they are forced to disband, it will mark a first in Korean history. Kim Hyun-bin, Arirang News.
And time now to get a check on some of the other global headlines we're following this hour. For that, we turn to our Eunice Kim standing by at the news center.
Eunice, police in Hong Kong have been clearing out protest sites on court injunctions. And just last night, the police ran into some pretty stiff resistance from the pro-democracy protesters there. And we understand there have been scores of arrests.
That's right, Mark. Hong Kong riot police detained 80 protesters following clashes that offered a very different picture from last week's clearance of a part of the Admiralty protest site outside CITIC Tower, where student protesters had even pitched in to help remove tents and fences. Several thousand demonstrators took back street barricades in the Mong Kok area on Tuesday evening after police had partially cleared it hours earlier. Many demonstrators said they remain defiant in their fight for fully free elections in Hong Kong's 2017 chief executive polls. Police clearances of protest sites are expected to continue as local media report a separate court order was granted to clear out an even larger part of Mong Kok on this Wednesday. Meanwhile, there is optimism in the U.S. economy as it appears to be continuing on its recovery streak. The Commerce Department raised the country's third quarter GDP growth on Tuesday to an annualized 3.9%. That's from the 3.5% rate reported last month. The gain was attributed to improvements in business and consumer spending, coupled with a 4.6% surge observed in the second quarter. The fresh figures mark the strongest 6 months of growth the American economy has seen in more than a decade. And finally, Pope Francis made a very brief trip to Strasbourg, France, during which he challenged the European Parliament to re-energize Europe. He said the continent had become too fearful and self-absorbed, like a haggard grandmother, and urged it to go beyond bureaucratic technicalities and return to the great ideas which once inspired Europe. He also encouraged the EP to create more jobs and to restore dignity to labor by ensuring proper working conditions. Unemployment in the European Union is at around 10%. Parts of Greece is still bogged down by youth unemployment rates that exceed 40%.
Stay up to date on the latest news out of Korea, connecting to our team of reporters about the issues that matter to Korea. On air, on your mobile, online. Find out more about Korea on Newsline at noon with Mark Broome and Eoh Jin-joo.
I'm Eoh Jin-joo with Pro.
Market researcher, strategy analytics, said Thursday that LG Electronics brought in about 11.
Technology doesn't just make our lives more convenient, it can mean life-altering changes for those living with disabilities. In the latest example, Samsung Electronics has developed a new computer mouse aimed at helping people who would otherwise be unable to use the internet in the traditional way. Sun Jung-in has more.
Shin Hyung-jin has suffered from a rare disease since birth that has weakened his muscles and leaves him unable to move. The graduate student in computer science at Yonsei University in Seoul relies mainly on his sight to interact with the world. Now, thanks to a new eye mouse developed by Samsung Electronics, Shin can now interact more easily with his computer. This is a second-generation eye-tracking mouse dubbed the iCan Plus that comes with better calibration sensitivity and an overall improvement in user experience. Users can move the mouse cursor on the screen with their eyes and click by blinking or staring at a specific link for a moment.
We developed this device in hopes that people with disabilities can easily communicate with the world.
Samsung says it plans to donate units of the new eye mouse to charities and will open and share related technologies to promote further development of the sector. Son Jung-in, Arirang News.
Korean is the 13th most spoken language in the world, ahead of even French, you might be surprised to learn. And interest in learning Korean language is growing by the year. For some, that interest stems from a love of K-pop music. For others, it's a desire to live and work here in Korea. Whatever the reason, efforts are underway to nurture this great interest, with the goal of hopefully boosting Korea's exposure to the world and, by extension, then bringing some fresh life into the economy. Shin Se-min reports.
He wasn't driven by K-pop. Ethiopian student Bizayo Bekata came to Korea to study medicine, inspired by Korean doctors who are treating the sick back in his home country. But before he could even begin his desired field of study, Bekata first had to learn the language it was being taught in.
아직까지 어려운 건 쓰기예요. 한국 쓰기. 계속 예를 들면 전화 쓰면 못 따라듣는 거 있으면은 다시 플레이하고 그런 식으로 했어요.
More than 86,000 foreigners were receiving paychecks in Korea as of last year. To attract more, the government has rolled out a plan to issue more work visas.
중요하죠. 지금 터키에서 예전에는 한국어에 대한 인식이 높지는 않았는데 요즘 한류 덕분이기도 하고 한국 기업들 때문이기도 한데 이렇게 한국과 졸업생들은 대부분 다 취직이 되고요. 이스탄불이나 큰 도시에 터키 큰 도시에 있는 한국 기업들에 취직이 되고.
The Cyber University of Korea is facilitating efforts by offering free online language courses in 5 languages. The founder of the program says he plans to personalize teaching materials for foreigners working in different fields.
With the lessons that are provided, foreigners will have no trouble handling casual, everyday conversations. But I think providing them with the skills to understand language specific to their field will help bring more foreign workers to Korea.
Language is no longer just a form of communication, but also a medium that opens doors to a country's culture. The learning and teaching of the Korean language could also soon become the driving force behind the growth of the Korean economy. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. It's still raining in Jeju heavily at times, but it should let up before midday. In the meantime, other parts of the country are covered by patches of clouds, but things will brighten up as the day moves on. And as we've all noticed, temperatures have been really generous lately. In fact, the highest temperature for the seasonal norm is actually Seoul's low today. So temperatures have been hovering way above the seasonal averages. And with that, let's see if other regions will also have a mild afternoon. Now, the highs in Daegu and Gwangju will peak at 15 and Busan will top out at 16 this afternoon. And as for the other regions, Jeju Island and Daejeon will get up to 14 and Dokdo will see a high of 11. Now, temperatures will remain on the mild side for the remainder of the week and into the weekend. But afternoon showers on Sunday will drag down the temperatures and will kick off December with wintry weather next week, with lows dipping below the freezing point. Well, that's all for me today. Let's send it back to Mark and Jin-joo in the studio.
Thank you, Jin, as always. And that does it for this Wednesday edition of Newsline at Noon.
Yes, and please join Jin-joo and I at 12 noon Korea time tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.